This is North Korea, one of the most struggling nations run by an autocratic regime with no trace of freedom. And this is South Korea, a completely different world, a well-to-do nation and a democracy with all sorts of freedoms. These two countries share a land border, a rich history, a common language, a vibrant culture, ethnic demographics, and much more. However, one thing that they don't share with each other is democratic ties. Their brutal past has created great animosity between them, so much so that if you were to make a list of nations that hate each other, you wouldn't put this pair anywhere outside your top 5. So why do they hate each other? And how is this hate affecting the economies of both these countries? We'll discuss it today. But why? It's not like it impacts us, does it? Well, yes, it does affect the global economy. But how? This is the story of the conflict between the two Koreas and how it impacts the local and global economy. Conflict explained. To understand the conflict between these two countries, let's delve into the modern history of the peninsula. Korea remained under Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945. After Japan left Korea on August 15, 1945, Korea was divided into two parts. How so? After the war, someone had to take control of the occupied lands temporarily. To decide on that, leaders from these three allied forces, the USA, Soviet Union, and Great Britain, met at a conference known as the Yalta Conference. As per what they decided, the Soviet Union took control of the northern side of Korea while the USA took control of the southern side, dividing Korea into two halves from the 38th parallel. Initially, this divide was supposed to be temporary. However, by 1948, two separate governments had been established: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north and the Republic of Korea in the south. In 1950, backed by the Soviet forces, North Korea attacked the south and started the Korean War. At first, the North pushed the South Korean troops to Busan. Then came the UN troops, and they pushed North Korean forces back, eventually capturing Seoul and then even the city Pyongyang. In response to this, Communist China sent its troops to the North Korean side, pushing the UN troops back. Long story short, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, when the border looked like this, and it still looks like this. Since the two nations never signed a peace treaty, they are technically still at war. Both countries believe that the land on the other side still belongs to them. Thus, they do not recognize each other's authorities or the claims to the land that either one sits on. The two nations might have a lot in common, but they don't share a political ideology. North Korea is technically a communist country, while South Korea is capitalist. Due to their political ideologies and their historical relations, it's pretty obvious that Russia and China are close allies of North Korea, while the USA is a close ally of South Korea. Despite the fact that they hate each other and want to take over, they have somehow managed not to get into an actual war since the armistice. However, that does not mean they never will. There have been good and bad times, and recently it's getting worse than ever. The North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un warned the South of a war only recently.
그리고 미국에는 상상해보지 못한 재앙과 패배를 안길 것입니다.
South Korea didn't shy away after this either. In response to the threat, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol responded,
합동 점검하면서 대비 태세를 확고하게 유지하고 있습니다. 북한이 도발해온다면 우리는 이를 몇 배로 응징할 것입니다.
But let's hope these statements remain political and the situation doesn't turn into all-out war. This conflict's impact on the economy of the two countries has already caused more than enough harm. Impacts on the local economy. We're about to discuss how this conflict has impacted the two countries' economies, but if these topics interest you, be sure to take a moment to subscribe and hit the thumbs up button for more of today's economic stories. A quick disclaimer. Every stat we give about North Korea is based on estimates, as their government is not very transparent about their happenings and estimates across external sources vary. First, let's look at the effects of the war on the North Korean economy. If we look at the combined losses of North Korea and China, the total damage was estimated at around 420 billion won, roughly 4 times North Korea's 1953 GNP. 8,700 factories and state enterprises, 600,000 housing units, and over 5,000 schools disappeared in smoke. Additionally, 370,000 hectares of rice paddies and fields were destroyed on the DMZ's northern side. However, the impact of the conflict isn't limited to the post-war times, and it continues to affect Koreans today. North Korea is one of the hungriest nations on Earth. Over 53% of the nation's population is starving. In such a situation, a country's job is to put the maximum resources into feeding its people.
심지어 저희 할머니도 아사라 돌아가셨고.
However, North Korea cannot do that. One reason is that it has a weak economy, one of the weakest in the region, with a total GDP of $43.3 billion. North Korea ranks at the 89th spot globally. Another reason is that a large share of this weak economy goes to the military. North Korea spends 36% of its GDP on the military. However, without this conflict, the situation could have been different, or maybe not. Many would say that the situation for ordinary citizens might be the same with or without the conflict. The military savings would have only benefited the ruling Kim family, and maybe that's true. I mean, 53% of the population is hungry and starving. But this isn't the situation if we head south. They don't have an obese leader or skyrocketing poverty. But even if they did, their economy would have been able to feed them. With a GDP of $1.67 trillion, South Korea ranks 13th globally. So one can say that this half suffers a lot less from the conflict. However, it would be false to say that the conflict does not affect the South Korean economy, because it does. First, let's look at how the Korean War impacted the South Korean economy. The war destroyed about 51% of the industry and 80% of the power plants. The total war damage faced by South Korea is estimated to be around 41.23 billion won. One can say that the South faced much less damage than the North. However, since the South and its allies were all capitalists, trade was severely affected, and South Korea witnessed hyperinflation because of the war. During the first 3 months of the war, the total money in circulation increased by 72%, and the situation only worsened later. 7 decades later, South Korea recovered from the war damage, but not the conflict. Even today, they spend a lot on the military. $47.9 billion was spent on the military in the year 2023, a number even higher than the total GDP of North Korea. Overall, South Korea is the 11th highest military spender on Earth. Although the percentage of the Korean budget that goes to the military isn't much higher than the global average of 2.3%, South Korea is affected in many indirect ways. For example, South Korea requires all able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 28 to serve between 18 and 21 months in the military or social service. So many doctors, researchers, and young entrepreneurs will take a gap from the fields they're most productive in to serve in the military or civil service. Recognized K-pop are given a relaxation to delay up till 30. However, there is no exception from the service either. The K-pop industry plays a huge role in the Korean economy. 1.7% of the Korean economy comes from K-pop, and when K-pop idols take a break and go for military service, it impacts the economy directly. Take the famous boy band BTS, for example. The band made up 0.3% of the national GDP in 2019, but they are bound by law to serve in the military. Their time in the military means that the country will lose the revenues that were to be made by the band. Now, I can list many other factors that pose an indirect impact of the conflict on both economies. Still, you get the point. Let's move ahead and look into the effects of this conflict on the global economy outside the peninsula. Impacts on the global economy. This world is a global village, and any conflict impacts the global economy. The stock market in every country suffered after the Russian-Ukrainian war started. Something similar might happen if the Korean conflict gets any worse. No matter where you are from, you might face the consequences. However, these two nations will have the most impact. Number 1. Japan. For starters, South Korea is Japan's third biggest trade partner. If a war broke out in Korea, big Japanese exporters would suffer the most. Koreans wouldn't be able to buy those products, and supply chains would be disrupted, hurting the profits of Japanese companies. This will predict a hike in yen prices, and when investors start buying the Japanese yen as a safe haven, that will push the yen further up, making Japanese goods more expensive overseas, again hurting exporters. In our video on Japan, we discussed how the Japanese economy is barely surviving. Well, this would hurt them even more. Number 2. Vietnam. Vietnam is South Korea's third largest partner, and South Korea is also Vietnam's third largest trading partner. The two nations have more mutual trade than Korea and Japan. Also, Vietnam's debt burden is pretty high. The nation had a debt to GDP ratio of 42.8% of GDP in 2021. If one of the largest trading partners diverts its focus to the war, the debt-ridden Vietnam might be unable to buffer the economic shock and suffer a lot. According to Moody, one of the leading sources for economic and financial insights on exponential risk, the US and China will have short-term exposure, but in the longer term, the implications will be relatively limited for them. However, when you consider that in the case of a war, these nations might be directly affected as they'll most likely send their troops, you feel that these two might see consequences even worse than Japan and Vietnam. Among the industries that will suffer the most globally is the electronics industry. You see, this small thing called a semiconductor chip or integrated circuit chip is just as useful for electronic devices as a wheel is for mechanical devices. Be it your smartphone that you're watching this video on, or the computers that we use to make this video, all of them use the semiconductor chip. Where does it come from? Well, South Korea is the second largest producer of these chips, and if they get busy with war, these chips are going to get expensive. That means all electronic devices will become more expensive. So, if you haven't bought an iPhone by selling your kidney yet, you might have to sell two later. Let's hope this never happens and that the situation only gets better from here. War has no winners. Both sides suffer losses, not just economic ones, but also precious human lives. But in the end, we don't know what the future holds. What do you think? Do you think that the two nations will come close in the future, or that war is a given? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you remained with us until the end of the video, leave a peace emoji below in the comments, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay tuned.